everybody and welcome back to Nerdy Miniatures. In today's video, we're going to be talking through how I made our second and final Armies on Parade board of 2025. This was a complex project. It required some new mediums that I haven't worked with before, but it was still very enjoyable. So want to see how I did it? Then just keep on watching. Let's begin with the theme and what we wanted the board to look like. We decided to go for a Middle-earth theme for this board, and using pieces from the Warhammer Strategy Battle Game series, we depicted the Fellowship as they enter Moria and get attacked by the Watcher in the water. This meant I had to create a mountain scene like my other board, except we also wanted to create some water, the Doors of Durin, some bones, and a tree, as this will mostly match the scene from the movie. To begin, we started with the board. This was half the size of our previous board, measuring at 1 foot by 1 foot. Once we marked out where we wanted things to go, we began. To start this project, I sanded the edges of the board as it began to splinter, and then I moved on to making my tree. I used the same technique for this tree that I'd done on my previous board, but for a little reminder, I did this by twisting thin pieces of wire together, making it into a tree shape, before covering it in hot glue later on. As you can see, my cats were a big fan of this step. I have some leftover textured foam from my previous board, and I decided, instead of being wasteful, to use that instead to make Durin's door. This door ended up requiring a lot of trial and error, but I did end up using the door section of the foam in the end. I covered the foam with the same matte varnish that I used on my previous board to make sure the foam was sealed so that any paint that I would apply later wouldn't absorb straight into it. Now it was time to make the bones. This was a combination of animal and dwarven bones, so they'd be different sizes. To make these, I used air drying clay. This took a while, as I've never made bones before, but it was still thoroughly enjoyable. Now the foam piece was dry, it was time to carve out the door. I made a bit of a mistake by sticking this door to the board so early, as I ended up having to remove it later, but it was easily fixed. Now it was time to move on to the fun part, expanding foam. I ended up building this up, carving into it, and then going back in later to cover most of the board to help create some dimension and levels. As I said, I removed the door, and using an acetone-based nail polish and a glove, I smoothed the edges of the foam while it was still wet to control the spread. Once it was dry, I reapplied the door and added more foam to 3/4 of the board to build up the layers and dimension that I wanted. Using hot glue, I then filled in the larger holes left in the foam and carved into it with a knife off camera. Now it was time to start figuring out placement. So using the watcher in the water, I painted in another video, which I will link in the description down below. I figured out how much space I would need to fit in the door and the fellowship. Once I was confident with my placement, I began to base the foam with PVA to prime it for the painting stage later. I also went ahead and started making a dirt base. For this, I mixed fake dirt and PVA glue and applied it to the base and left it to dry. Now it was time to paint the floor and the cave. For this, I mixed browns, blacks and greys to cover the expanding foam and make it look more cave-like, and to make the ground look more ground-like. For the ground, I also added splashes of dark green to create algae. Once all the paint was dry, I began to place my bones, which I coated in the paint Skeleton Horde from Citadel Paints to give them a dingy colour, and I then secured them to the board using some super glue. At this point I made an error. I stuck down my tree, which I would later have to remove when I poured my resin, as I had to make an acrylic box around the board later. Now it was time to add some vegetation. So using my moss that I'd left over from my first board, I secured some of this onto the board, focusing on the cave. Now it's time to move on to the acrylic and resin. I didn't record this part as it required a lot of concentration, but basically we purchased some acrylic sheets off of Amazon, and using a lot of hot glue, I glued the pieces together around the board to create an airtight or almost airtight container. Once the box was made, I poured around 500ml of UV resin into the container that I tinted using green and brown contrast paints from Citadel Paints. This did start to leak out at one point, so I had to use my mini UV pen to secure it because I didn't want to lose all that resin overnight. In total, this resin took about 3 days to fully set, and we had to purchase UV lights to do so, but eventually it did set, thank God. The smartest thing to do though would have been to work in thin, smaller layers and build it up. But anyway, that is a lesson learned. Whilst the resin dried, I painted the door of Durin using the same 3 paints I used to cover the rest of the cave previously. As of course, this is supposed to look like it blends in, it's not supposed to be that obvious. I then removed the acrylic case and began to paint the finishing touches. I did the outline of the door of Durin and made it look vaguely recognisable from the scene. I did originally plan on adding the runes, but unfortunately, I ran out of time. Now all that was left to do was to glue the fellowship onto the board. I have a tutorial on how to paint the fellowship already up on the channel, which I'll once again link in the description down below if you want to see how I did this. I made sure when I placed the figures that I was telling a story, so having Gandalf's back to the Watcher as he was trying to open the door, and having all the others engaging in combat with the Watcher, trying to fight it off to buy time. And that is it. That is my entire Watch It in the Water, Lord of the Rings, Armies on Parade board completed. Unfortunately, our board did not win an award this time round, but there is always next year. And regardless, I'm very happy with how this board turned out. Overall, a review of Armies on Parade 2025, I'm pretty happy with it. We entered into 3 categories, the individual armies category and 2 board categories. I didn't win anything for my army, we won bronze for our second, and we didn't win anything for our third. But to win something in our first year ever doing this is still pretty impressive, and I'm really proud of it. So hopefully next year we can go for silver, or better yet, maybe even go for 2, or possibly even 3 medals. Down in the description you will find a link to Mr. Nerd's channel. So if you enjoy MMOs and action RPGs, then please feel free to have a look at that. If you enjoy Warhammer lore, which I can assume you do if you are watching this, then please feel free to have a look at my other channel, where I cover Tolkien lore, Lord of the Rings lore, Warhammer lore, and other fantasy lore as well. If that's more your cup of tea, then please feel free to have a look at that. Anyway, that'll be it from me today. Have a wonderful day, or night, wherever you are in the world. And as always, bye for now, guys.